Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the Chinese electric vehicle company BYD, which is also known as Build Your Dreams. And you can see here some of the footage of the cars that BYD make. They're very stylish and they are the market leader globally in electric vehicles. They've overtaken Tesla as being the world's biggest seller of electric vehicles. And they've been targeting a variety of different countries, including Brazil, which you may or may not know is the sixth largest automobile market in the world. And actually, BYD bought a factory that Ford abandoned in 2021 in the summer of 2024. And this was seen as a major step forward in terms of the collaboration between China and Brazil. And China was looking to invest money into Brazil, and it was going to build out that factory, expand it significantly, and create jobs in Brazil, not just working in the factory, but also in the component sector. But things haven't quite gone to plan. And in fact, that factory was closed down due to labor abuse issues. So, in today's video, I want to go through the meteoric rise of BYD, talk about how rapidly they've grown. They've actually built an enormous carrier to move 9,600 cars at any one time. You'll have a look at that vessel in a video in a moment. It is absolutely massive. And they are moving 9,500 cars at a time to Brazil to flood the Brazilian car market. So, what we're seeing here is a really interesting story whereby China looks like it's helping Brazil. It's reaching out to Brazil in terms of helping it to expand its car market. But under the surface of that initial story, which looks like good news for Brazil, there are lots of other things going on. Firstly, with regards to how BYD is treating its employees. And then secondly, how many Brazilians are actually being employed. There is a lot of Chinese people being moved over from China along with the BYD business. And then thirdly, how China is trying to take a stranglehold over the Brazilian car market. Now, in terms of BYD itself, this chart shows the company's annual revenues from 1995, when it was reportedly started. Obviously, it wasn't an electric vehicle company at that time. It was a traditional ICE company, internal combustion engine. And you can see that between 1995 and 2005, there was very little growth in terms of the company's revenues. Between 2005 and 2015, the company grew at a reasonable rate, but nothing earth-shattering. Between 2015 and 2020, we started to see the company expanding its revenue. And between 2020 and 2024, we have seen a meteoric rise in this business. Its revenues have increased more than 7 times over the past few years. And the reason how it's managed to do that is because it's been expanding rapidly into the growing electric vehicle market. And it's just been announced that BYD is now aiming to sell more than half of all of the vehicles that it's manufacturing outside of China by 2030. So within the next 5 years, it's going to be majority exports for BYD. And I thought it was worth having a look at which companies are the biggest in the world in terms of the electric vehicle market. And you may or may not be familiar with all of the names on this list. So you can see that in 2024, BYD actually sold 4.14 million electric vehicles. And that's a combination of what's called BEV, battery electric vehicle, which is the Tesla version, and then also the hybrid, whereby you've got some other form of fuel in there as well. Because hybrids, for a lot of people, are seen as being that sort of happy medium that you get the benefits of renewable and electric, but you get a bit more range. And if your battery runs out, then you can still get home. Tesla is the world's second largest manufacturer of and retailer of electric vehicles, having sold just under 1.8 million in 2024. And in terms of the market shares, you can see that BYD is almost at 25%, compared with around 10% for Tesla. And the reason that it's 10% here, you may have seen higher figures than that, is that this covers the hybrid market as well. And obviously, Tesla isn't in the hybrid market, but when you're looking at the combined electric and electric hybrid markets, Tesla's only sitting at 10%. Number 3 on the list, surprisingly to some people, SAIC GM Wuling, that you've probably never heard of. They sold just under 700,000 vehicles, most of them in China. That represents a market share of around 4%. BMW is the fourth largest at the moment, having sold over 500,000 vehicles, giving them a market share of 3%. BMW, obviously, from Germany. And then we've got six other Chinese companies here. So Li Auto, who you may or may not be familiar with, they sold a similar number to BMW. Geely, which does actually include Volvo, which it acquired, and the Polestar brand, they've got around 3% of the market. And then GAC, Zeekr, Xpeng, and Chery are the other brands. So the reason I wanted to show this is just to show how dominant BYD is, because they've made sales in 2024 that were equivalent to basically all of the rest of the top 10 added together. So this is becoming a really big company, and they're dominating this space. And one of the reasons why they're selling so many vehicles is that they're selling them at a very low price. So there's been a lot of talk, and I've spoken about this previously, about the Chinese authorities rumored to be subsidizing these electric vehicle manufacturers. And the way that they're subsidizing them is basically not making them pay any tax, giving them land for free, giving them lots of grants and incentives. So basically putting cash into the business without needing any sort of return on it, and essentially promoting these companies so that they get to the point where they can sell their vehicles much cheaper than overseas manufacturers. And the problem that represents is obviously consumers like a deal. So if you can get a good deal, then you might think about buying a Chinese car. But ultimately, if that puts all the other car manufacturers out of business in the long term in the electric vehicle market, if it just doesn't become profitable for them, then these guys would have a monopoly over the market. And clearly at that point, firstly, you've got geopolitical risk of China being the world's supplier of vehicles. And then secondly, you've got the risk that they then decide to start ramping the prices up once all of the other companies are out of business and no longer able to make vehicles. Now, in order to counter that, many countries have introduced tariffs. And obviously the USA, we talked a lot about tariffs recently. And I thought this chart was worth throwing up. It looks at the top 10 car markets and looks at the level of tariffs against Chinese vehicles at the moment. So China's the biggest car market. It's selling around 28 million vehicles per year. There is a population of 1.4 billion. So in relative terms, it's still percentage-wise lower than the USA for per capita, but it's the biggest single market. Obviously, there's no tariff on Chinese vehicles in China. The USA, next biggest market with 16 million. You can see that's significantly bigger than all of the rest of the markets in the top 10. And Joe Biden introduced a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. So basically doubling the price. So if it was going to sell for $10,000, it will actually sell for $20,000 because the US is basically wanting to make sure that the prices aren't ridiculously low and undercutting all of the other manufacturers, particularly the US manufacturers. In Japan, the third biggest market with 5 million vehicles, there's a 10% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Germany have recently been part of the EU investigation into Chinese manufacturers, and there's a 10% base tariff and then a spread depending on how receptive each of the Chinese brands were to giving information to the EU, and that can go up to 45%. So a pretty high tariff in Germany and the rest of the European Union. India, fifth biggest market with 3 million. They've got tariffs of up to 100%. And Brazil, which is what I want to go into in more detail in this video, is the sixth biggest market, selling 2 million vehicles per year. Now, at the moment, there's a 10% tariff on Chinese EVs. That's increasing to 35% by 2026. And some people are calling for that increase to be introduced now. And we'll hear why later in the video. The UK is the seventh biggest market, similar size to Brazil. No tariff at all on Chinese imports. The only country that hasn't applied tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, which basically makes it an outlier when you're looking at what the rest of the world is doing. So if you're in the UK at the moment and you want to buy an electric vehicle, you'll be able to get a really good deal on Chinese EVs because there are no tariffs on it. Basically, compared to the USA, it'd be half price because the USA is adding 100% tariff. France, Italy are both in the European Union, so they are the same as Germany. And Canada is the 10th largest car market in the world, about 1.5 million sales per year. They've also got a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Now, as I said earlier in the video, BYD actually acquired an old car plant that was abandoned by Ford in 2021. They gave up on the Chinese market. They couldn't make any profit on it. And they paid around $50 million for this site. And that wasn't really the payment that was important. It was the fact that BYD were committing to build vehicles in Brazil, and they were going to then create jobs in Brazil. And this was seen as being a really good thing for the Brazilian economy. However, it's now being reported that BYD is flooding the Brazilian car market with cheap electric vehicles in the same way as it's been trying to do in other markets. And because there's only a low tariff at the moment, they're becoming more attractive to consumers. And in terms of looking at the Brazilian market itself, you can see from this chart how things have changed since the start of 2023. So this chart shows the percentage of the Brazilian electric vehicle market represented by 3 of the biggest car manufacturers, all of which are Chinese owned. You can see that back in the first quarter of 2023, around 40% of the market was dominated by the Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers. And the biggest single player at that point was Volvo, so not really a Chinese brand. But over the last 2 years, you can see the meteoric growth of BYD, the blue section at the bottom here. And in the latest quarter, the first quarter of 2025, BYD now accounts for around 65% of all electric vehicle sales. And when you add on top GWM and Volvo, the share of the market taken up by Chinese manufacturers is now close to 90%. So this is one of the reasons why Brazilian car manufacturers are complaining about allowing BYD to expand at such a rapid rate. So let's hear a bit more about what's going on at the moment, and then we'll talk about the labour abuse issues that have been highlighted at the new BYD plant in Brazil.
It's the world's biggest car carrier, containing the equivalent of 20 football fields full of vehicles. And it recently docked in Brazil for the first time, disgorging thousands of cars made by Chinese giant BYD. While that could mean budget autos for local buyers, not everyone is so happy about the new arrival. Brazil's own automakers say the flood of cheap cars threatens their viability. Igor Calve is president of the country's Association of Automotive Vehicle Manufacturers. He says the imports send a message that it's better to bring in foreign vehicles than make them in Brazil. BYD has developed a fleet of ships to boost its overseas ambitions, and right now Brazil is its top target. The country's car market is the world's 6th largest by volume, and industry groups say Chinese firms are taking advantage of low import tariffs. They're urging the government to bring forward plans for higher levies to protect domestic makers. Other regions, including the EU and US, have moved much faster to impose steep duties. BYD and other Chinese firms are rushing to expand overseas amid tough competition and slim profits at home. In all, the country's vehicle exports to Brazil are forecast to soar almost 40% this year to around 200,000 units. BYD also has plans to make vehicles in the country, but that too has become controversial. Ministers initially cheered its purchase of a former Ford plant, saying it would help create jobs. But a subsequent investigation into labour abuses on the site has pushed back plans for full production to late next year. What happens next will be closely watched around the world, not least in Europe. There too, BYD is fast ramping up sales and says it plans to begin local production before the year is out.
So you saw some imagery there in that video of some Chinese workers. And the reason why that picture was there was because when BYD bought this plant off of Ford, the old Ford factory, it needed some work. And so they needed to spend millions of dollars to expand it and to improve it and to also convert it from being an internal combustion engine production facility to an electric vehicle facility. And as you heard in the video, there was initial excitement when BYD were given the contract, when they were allowed to buy this plant. And then there was disappointment because what BYD did was immediately appoint a Chinese construction firm to do all of the work. So they didn't create any jobs in Brazil. They basically brought over lots of Chinese workers to expand this facility. Now, when they first bought it in June 24, BYD announced that the factory was going to open in March 25. So that's quite ambitious. Basically, within 9 months, they were going to start car production. And basically, they were having to take this plant that had been mothballed for around 4 years and convert it and bring it up to speed. So it was going to require a lot of work in a short space of time. Now, it was reported by Reuters that the workers who traveled from China to Brazil were earning around $70 for a 10-hour shift, so $7 per hour. Probably not that great, depending on where you live in the world, but certainly that's below minimum wage in a lot of the developed world. But that was more than twice what those workers were being paid in China. So this was a really attractive deal. So lots of Chinese workers signed up to go to Brazil to do this work. But unfortunately, the conditions that they were given and provided with were seen to be effectively like slave labor. And the authorities in Brazil actually went in and closed the site down. They said that it was below acceptable standards. And it was reported, this is the official paper that the Brazilian Public Ministry posted on their website. You can go online and see this. It's publicly available. And in that paper, they've said that their task force had to rescue 163 workers from the site. And we'll go through the details of this report now in terms of what they actually identified as being the problems. So they've said that the rescue of 163 workers who were being held in conditions analogous to slavery and the closure of the lodgings and part of the construction site of the plant where the car manufacturer Build Your Dreams is installing a factory in the municipality of Camaçari in the metropolitan region of Salvador was communicated on Monday morning. So this was in December 2024. So basically a couple of days before Christmas Day, this happened. The conditions found in the lodgings revealed an alarming picture of precariousness and degradation. In the first lodging on Colorado Street, the workers slept on beds without mattresses and had no lockers for their personal belongings, which were mixed in with food supplies. The sanitary situation was especially critical, with only one bathroom for every 31 workers, forcing them to wake up at 4 a.m. to form a line and be ready to leave for work at 5:30 a.m. The second lodging on Colorado Street, which was used mainly by welders, presented similarly precarious conditions. Although there was material on the beds, they were in fact only 3 centimetre thick coverings, so that's around 1 inch. Insufficient to provide minimum conditions for use, with some beds not even having such coverings. All the accommodations shared serious infrastructure and hygiene problems. The bathrooms, in addition to being insufficient, were not separated by sex, did not have adequate toilet seats, and presented poor hygiene conditions. The lack of a suitable place to wash clothes led workers to use their own bathrooms for this purpose. The situation in some of the food courts was equally precarious. The kitchens operated in alarming conditions with no adequate The situation in some of the food courts was equally precarious. The kitchens operated in alarming conditions with no adequate cupboards for food storage. In one particular serious case, construction materials were found near the food, and food was stored near the bathrooms in unsanitary conditions. Only one of the barracks had an improvised dining hall with wooden benches and tables in a semi-covered area, which was still insufficient for all the workers, forcing most of them to eat their meals in their beds. In one of the rooms occupied by a cook, pots with prepared food were found left open on the floor, exposed to dirt without refrigeration to be served the following day. The workers consumed water directly from the tap without treatment and even took it to work in bottles. The conditions at the construction site also revealed serious irregularities. The cafeteria at the workplace used coolers to serve meals without ensuring minimum hygiene conditions. The chemical toilets, only 8 for approximately 600 workers, were in a deplorable state, without toilet paper, water, or adequate maintenance, in addition to not respecting the minimum distances established by the regulations. The workers were exposed to intense solar radiation, showing visible signs of skin damage. Several workplace accidents were recorded, including one case in which a worker suffered an accident due to sleep deprivation caused by inadequate housing conditions and long working hours. Another serious case involved a worker who suffered an eye injury in April and, despite requesting ophthalmological care, never received the appropriate medical follow-up. The work presented multiple irregularities related to the work environment, leading to the embargo of deep excavation activities and the partial closure of the establishment, specifically the kitchen of one of the accommodations on Rue Colorado. A circular table saw was also closed for not having any safety measures. In addition to the degrading conditions, the situation constitutes forced labour due to several indicators found during the inspections. The workers were required to pay a deposit, had 60% of their wages withheld, receiving only 40% in Chinese currency, faced excessive costs for terminating their contracts, and had their passports withheld by the company. Early termination of the contract implied the loss of the deposit and the amounts withheld, in addition to the obligation to pay for the return ticket and reimburse the cost of the outbound ticket. To give you an idea, if a worker tried to terminate the employment contract after 6 months, he would leave the country without actually receiving anything for his work, since the discount of the deposit, the ticket to come to Brazil, and the payment of the return ticket would, in practice, constitute a total confiscation of the amounts received by the workers throughout the employment relationship. The working day, in turn, was already set in the contract at 10 hours per day, which was aggravated by the lack of regular granting of breaks provided in the instrument. A worker who was the victim of a work accident was identified as not having had a break for 25 days. This worker reported tiredness and drowsiness at the time of the accident, demonstrating that the long working hours and the housing conditions, which prevented rest, were crucial factors in the accident. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's really interesting having a look at what's happened with the BYD situation in Brazil, because I think immediately when you hear about companies investing overseas, you would think that that is a good thing. That's helping that economy to expand and develop. That business will be creating jobs in the region. It will be building things and then basically making that economy stronger. But what we've seen in today's video is that the association of BYD with Brazil doesn't look like it's helping Brazilian businesses, because even though BYD has taken over the abandoned car plant that Ford left behind, and you would have thought that that would create lots of employment and spending in Brazil, what we've seen is that BYD immediately hired a Chinese construction company to come over and do all the work for it. So local businesses didn't benefit from that. And that business was importing materials from China that it needed to do the work. So there weren't any purchases in Brazil of the materials needed. As we've also seen from that labour investigation, those Chinese workers weren't actually being paid. They had these very restrictive conditions whereby they had to pay a deposit up front. So essentially lodge some money with BYD in advance to cover 60% of their wages potentially, which is a huge amount. They then were being paid in Chinese yuan, which you can't use in Brazil, but they weren't actually being given it. Most of it was being sent directly to their bank accounts in China. So none of that was actually helping the Brazilian economy, because we had these people who are basically being flown in from China, not really being paid anything in cash, not being allowed out because they're working for 10 hours per day, and then they were sleeping in these not great conditions thereafter. So they weren't going out in the local environment. They weren't going to local bars and restaurants and spending money to boost the economy. They were basically just there to do the work. And then it's also been reported that the BYD contracts, most of their components were going to come from China. BYD basically said that they would like to get to the point where 25% of the components were being made in Brazil. But interestingly, the way that they were going to do that is by asking some of the other Chinese component manufacturers to set up facilities in Brazil as well. So you'd have got a very similar situation where more Chinese companies are coming into Brazil, but they're effectively hiring Chinese workers and sending them over from China, and everything is being repatriated back to China in terms of all of their pay. So none of that is actually helping to expand the Brazilian economy. And what we saw from the charts earlier is that BYD is now dominant in Brazil. It's holding around 2/3 of the electric vehicle market. And when you add in the other Chinese manufacturers, it's basically the whole market. So Brazilian car companies are being squeezed out of their own market by Chinese businesses, basically already importing lots. But now that they're on the ground and are aiming to build cars in Brazil, then they'll be seen to be domestic effectively. And so they'll bypass a lot of the tariffs. So I think it's interesting that the initial idea of this must be good news for Brazil doesn't quite play out when you look at the details. And then in terms of the labor conditions, the details that we saw from the report from the Brazilian authorities, this is basically inhumane. Most countries have really good employment laws these days that protect employees to make sure that they've got right conditions, that you're getting enough breaks, you're not working too long, and usually you're going home to your own house. But in this situation, these workers had been brought over from China, and so they were effectively living on site in dormitories, which is quite a common thing in China. People will go and live on site in the factories for 10 or 11 months a year. So it's quite a common thing. So I think from the workers' point of view, they're used to doing that sort of routine. But I think what's different is when you look at the actual conditions, the way that they were described, it sounded more like a prison situation rather than being people in employment who were, having a nice time and enjoying things. And I mean, there's got to be some concerns about other countries signing up deals because BYD is a big business. And you saw from the adverts and the promo that I showed at the beginning of the video, their cars are very flashy. It looks very slick. It all looks very stylish. But underneath the surface, the company itself isn't doing things in the same way as you would expect a major multinational car manufacturer to be doing. So I wanted to post this video. Initially, when I started planning this video, I was going to just talk about the car market and what was happening globally and talk about electric vehicles. But when I came across this investigation into the labor abuse, I just thought that it was more interesting and more important to report that. So that's why this video has taken a bit more of an angle on that, because it really highlights the fact that even though a lot of Chinese businesses look like they're very similar to European businesses and American businesses at face value, beneath the surface, things are being done in a very different way. And I don't think you would find that from big US and European companies. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that support. It really helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.